It's also a good thing to remember those who've gone before us, as we have been doing, and as we're doing in this series that I've got going now on my predecessors. I am the seventh president in these 150 years as we celebrate our sesquicentennial year. I'm just taking the opportunity to trigger some thoughts about these six predecessors, and we come this morning to the second president of Wheaton College, Charles Albert Blanchard. And it's a good thing to listen to him again in the spirit of the year verse, that passage from Psalm 145, verse 4. One generation will commend your works to another. They will tell of your mighty acts. And we need to listen to what these previous generations, those who have gone before us in this place, have to say to us. And one of the persons to listen to is Charles Albert Blanchard, a very impressive fellow. He is the longest serving president by far in the seven presidents. In fact, in this 150 years, there have only been seven, and people often comment on the long tenures. The average tenure for college and university presidents these days is something like 6 or 7 years across the country, and here is only 7 in a century and a half, and that's striking. And it is that Wheaton has tended to have long tenures, but it's really, in some ways, less impressive than it might seem, since the first two, Jonathan Blanchard and Charles Blanchard, occupied the first 66 years. Jonathan Blanchard, the founder, went from 1860 to 1882, and it was his son who went from 82 all the way to 1925. That is a long tenure in this role. I can tell you after 17 years, I cannot imagine those 40-some years. But that's because Charles Albert Blanchard was a pretty impressive guy. I just want to touch base with Charles this morning and bring us up to speed on this particular window. Because if you were to ask yourself, how did Wheaton College go from 1860, this little sleepy, tiny little institution out in the middle of nowhere in the Illinois prairie, to the sophisticated and pretty high-powered, high-paced operation that Wheaton is today? How did they get from there to here? Well, one of the key answers to that would be the tenure of Charles Blanchard. And that's one of the key things I want us to see this morning. Charles Blanchard was the fifth of the 12 Blanchard children. Jonathan and Mary had 12 children. He was the fifth. At the age of 10, he was still living down in Galesburg, down south. Jonathan hadn't come north yet. Well, actually, I think Jonathan had, but the family hadn't joined him. He had been the president of Knox College down in Galesburg, and he was there the day the Lincoln-Douglas debate, the fifth Lincoln-Douglas debate, took place in Galesburg. It was a fascinating time for him. He was only 10 years old, and it marked him for life listening to that Lincoln-Douglas debate. The weather was poor. There were 15,000 to 20,000 people gathered for that debate. It boggles the mind to think of the contrast between then and now, that you would have these people gathered, these huge crowds, no microphones, and here they're gathered for this Senate debate. It wasn't a presidential series, it was for the Senate, and Douglas wound up winning. He was the incumbent, and he wound up winning that seat. Lincoln did not win it. But these Lincoln-Douglas debates took place during that very period of time, and this was the famous fifth debate. It went on for over 3 hours. If you go back and look at that debate, what you discover is that Douglas spoke for an entire hour. He was followed by an hour and a half from Lincoln, and then Douglas finished with another half hour. The entire thing went from 2:30 to 5:30, actually about 3 hours and 7 minutes. We have a detailed transcript. The newspapers in Chicago had sent stenographers down, took it down in shorthand, so we have a detailed transcript. You go back and read those transcripts, and then you look at the level of civil, political discourse in our day, and it's shocking to think that this crowd of just ordinary people would gather and listen for 3 hours to complex, nuanced, careful argumentation and debate. We live in the day of the Twitter of 140 characters. It's shocking to see what took place, but it marked him for life. If you listen to his account of it, he has some interesting observations. He says, the great Lincoln I heard in the Lincoln-Douglas debate when a boy of 10 was such a man that it never passed from my mind. The tall, angular, loose-jointed, benevolent-looking man, inexpensively clothed, contrasted with the short, well-dressed, polished-appearing opponent. The seething crowds, the bands of music, the storm of flags, the evident appeal to conscience and humanity in the speeches of Lincoln, and the deft, cunning, clever twisting and turning of his opponent. A sense of these came to me as a child and remained. He never grew out of it. It wasn't long after that he made his first trip here to Wheaton, following his father who had come before. He says of that journey, "We journeyed all night from Galesburg in the low, smoky, dingy coaches of the Burlington Railroad. Sleepy and tired and dust-covered and cinder-covered and smoky, we disembarked on the morning of an April day in Wheaton." His first image of Wheaton wasn't very impressive, and you can see why. At that time, this was just all prairie, and there was a railroad that came through, and just a railroad station, and just a small smattering of a handful of houses, but for the most part, it was open ground. A few farm plots, but for the most part, it was still prairie. He spoke of it this way when he saw Wheaton for the first time: a little huddle of farmhouses on the windswept prairie. Low ground in and around the town on which water stood the year round, swampy land. And on a hill, a half mile from the station, a single building, small, in ill repair, and in every way forbidding, stood in the midst of a campus which was and is, I don't get this point, but this is what he said, stood in the midst of a campus which was and is one of the most beautiful spots in the world. This young man had never been anyplace else yet. I just came from consortium meetings with other consortium presidents out at Westmont and Santa Barbara. He had never been to Santa Barbara. All things together, he said, the town was unspeakably dreary. That was his first glimpse of the town he was coming to. And all he saw was a little building, which was really sort of the center part of what we think of as Blanchard. That was it. That was the extent of Wheaton College facilities at the time. And that was the world that he came to. He came there as just this young man, became a teen here. He traveled west with his father. We talked about that last time, going all the way out to Utah, Salt Lake City, in a covered wagon with his father in the early 1880s or 1860s. An amazing trip, if you think about it. His father was the president of the college, and he goes off in the covered wagon. I don't get that either. He said he describes himself as an undistinguished student at the college. He was the first president of the college who was a graduate, an alumnus of the college. And later he did some traveling. He got as far as England and Scotland. Crossing the Atlantic back in the 1800s was no small feat. But he wound up back here again. As an adult, he became a tall, distinguished, handsome man, well-spoken, very well thought of, married a wonderful woman. In fact, he had 3 wives. His first wife died, and he married another one and was widowed from her, and then married a third one who wound up outlasting him, and together they had 7 daughters. They also had a son that they lost. Eventually, he became the pastor of the college church for about 5 years, and it was in his last year of his time at the college church that his father retired from the presidency of Wheaton College, and he stepped in at the age of 33 to become the second president of this institution. He was a very busy man. If you go back and look at his life, and by the way, a lot of the things that you can learn from this are from Paul Bechtel's book. Paul was one of our faculty members and wrote this book, Wheaton College, A Heritage Remembered. It's a wonderful book for just taking you through the history of the college all the way up to 1984. I recommend it to your reading. From the records that we have from Charles Blanchard, he was a really busy guy. He was on the faculty. According to the charter of Wheaton College, going back to 1859-60 with the state legislature, that's where we have our charter, the president is the chairman of the faculty. And he was an active teacher on the faculty. He taught a variety of courses and was one of the favorite members of the faculty to the students. But he also traveled widely, and I keep reminding myself of how difficult the travel was for someone like that, and so much of his travel had to do with fundraising. That too is striking if you stop and think about it. There's a tendency to think of the heavy-duty fundraising load of modern presidents as being a brand new thing in recent times, in the latter part of the 20th century. Well, not so. There is in our archives a stack this tall of little, not much about the size of a small pocket New Testament, leather-bound, little journals of his travels and his fundraising, and you have line after line after line in his meticulous handwriting. His penmanship is beautiful. He taught penmanship here at the college. I think about that. I can't even read my own penmanship, much less teaching it to someone else. It's a beautiful script that he writes, and he puts these names and then just little comments about these names, and it's amazing the people he visited. I mean, he got to some of the high echelons of finance in America of the time. J.P. Morgan, Wanamaker of the Wanamaker department stores, a whole series, Pullman of the railroad Pullman cars. He gets in front of these people one after the other, and there's just scores of these people that he's visiting in his fundraising. And I'm struck by the responses that he gets. He doesn't give a full record, he just gives a little note as to what he got in that particular visit. Here are just a few quotes. Call back in 1 or 2 weeks. Not at home. Can't now, perhaps in the spring. We'll think it over, was one comment. Won't say yes or no. Not now. Come again in 2 weeks. See me about April 1st. One guy says, the comment is, he doesn't believe in colleges. But here's my favorite one. He went to this one. Well, the guy before him says, I give too much as it is. But this is my favorite one. This is in quotation marks. The guy says, we are not a corporation. We have no souls. I can just hear the appeal that Charles Blanchard was making to him, and apparently it did not work. Well, as I say, Charles was a very busy man, on the run, pressured. It was a fledgling institution. He was very active, as his father was, in various kinds of social issues. He was now after the Civil War, and so the whole issue of slavery was no longer in play. But you see him going after very much 19th century issues, the liquor traffic, Sabbath breaking, secret societies like the Masons. This is the kind of social emphasis, social agenda that was very high on the church's agenda at the time. During his tenure, the college itself saw some very major transitions. Let me suggest a few. He stepped in when Wheaton was just this small little fledgling institution out on the prairie. In 1882, when he stepped in, the college had only 216 students, but even that is misleading because only 29 of them were college students. Remember, the academy, which was essentially a high school or prep school, and the college were one. And of those 216, only 29 were college students, and only 6 of them were in the senior class when he began. But he led the college to a period of tremendous transition from what colleges were in the 19th century to what they became in the 20th century. There were major additions to the campus. Blanchard filled out with these various wings. Blanchard, as we know now, started coming into being at the time. Williston was built under his term. Adams and Shell were built under his term. He saw tremendous growth, however, in the costs of the education, and you as students can appreciate this, watching costs just spiral up. Well, they spiraled up a lot faster during that period of time. In 1900, sort of in the middle of his tenure, tuition was $8 a term for a 3-term year, and board was $108 a year for your food. In 1905, 5 years later, it was $15 instead of $8. And missionary and pastoral kids wound up having to pay only half of that. In 1916, 16 years later, it had gone from $8 to $40 a semester. And by 1925, when he finished, it had gone from $8 to $55 a semester. In 1920, room and board was $85 per term, per semester. And you could get a room, it was advertised, electric lighted, steam heated rooms. This was high-tech stuff. You could get electric lighted, steam heated rooms from between $15 and $34 per person, depending on where you were. The 50-year celebration of the college took place under his tenure. That was in 1910. It was an interesting time. Let me read you just a couple of passages from the celebration. He actually spoke on that occasion and wrote some things, a brief history of the college. His description makes it clear that the religious life of the college has been from the beginning one of its principal interests. Men and women are not invited to the teaching staff who are not avowed Christians. This Christian identity went back to the beginning. But now listen to this. This is the president talking. The college does not favor dancing parties, card parties, theater parties. It favors lectures or art exhibits and all high-grade social pleasures. Acquaintance with literature, acquaintance with art, acquaintance with science, anything which rests the mind, strengthens the body, purifies the heart, ennobles the life, that's what is favored. And so far as conditions warrant, that's what is aided by the institution. Well, Wheaton never was a party school. We still aren't, at least if you listen to the Princeton Review. In 1910, commencement in that semi-centennial year, we are in the sesquicentennial year, 100 years before today. In that semi-centennial year, there were 11 students who graduated, or 11 orations that were given out of the graduating class, we should put it that way. There were 11 different speeches given at commencement. Here were some of the titles: Woman's Influence, The Price of Success, Jesus in History, and Good Citizenship. This was the subject matter of your predecessors as the students at Wheaton. It was during his tenure, of course, also that World War I broke out, August of 1914. It's really a sad story when you think about it, that each of the 7 presidents of Wheaton have been president during wartime. For Jonathan Blanchard, it was the Civil War. For Charles Blanchard, it was some lesser wars, and then culminating in this world cataclysm, World War I, from 1914 all the way through the late teens. The wartime commencement at Wheaton had only 12 graduates, and 9 of them were women. So many of the men were off at war. It was a sad time. There are a lot of changes during this time of his tenure, but the premier change, the greatest change, it was under his tenure that Wheaton went from that sleepy little 19th century vision of itself to a much more modern 20th century version that we are living out today. That was prior to his time. It was a time of general education. This was before the age of specialization. It's hard to us to believe just how much that was true. The older professors could cover 3 or 4 subjects in different fields well enough to teach undergraduates. Faculty had little graduate training. There were very few faculty with any kind of graduate training, and there were only 2 tracks available to students. One was the science track, and the other was sort of a humanities track. The strong gen ed core, you could take electives, but there were only these 2 tracks. President Blanchard taught moral and intellectual philosophy as well as psychology and ethics. But a massive expansion of knowledge was taking place in the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, and that led to the increasing compartmentalization of knowledge and learning. That ancient unity of knowledge was being abandoned, fragmented, and there was increasing specialization. So that now the students and faculty had to narrow their focus and begin to specialize. It was inevitable. There was no way around it. So that by the time you get to 1915, instead of just these 2 tracks, there were now 12 majors at the college. There were separate departments for the first time at the college in 1917. Previously, everyone had just been called professor. They were not ranks as we think of them today, professorial ranks. In the early 20s, the 1920s, we get the ranks professor, associate professor, assistant following. We were following the German model. The German model was this emphasis upon research, specialized education. The English model was not. In fact, the PhD at England is a late addition, and it was to American education as well. We were following the German model. It was under his tenure that took place. The first PhD on the faculty at Wheaton College didn't happen until 1925 under his tenure. The first accreditation or central association took place about that same time. In fact, they required the college to separate out from the academy, and that's where the academy and the college became separate entities. Well, these things were massive changes on the college and bringing the college into the kind of institution that you know today, but there were at least these 2 things that did not change. One of them was the motto representing the focus of the college for Christ and his kingdom. Actually, all the way back as far as 1846, you can see Jonathan Blanchard, when he was still down at Knox College, preaching about the kingdom of Christ. But it's as the 19th century unfolds and under Charles Blanchard that motto for Christ and his kingdom really comes to the fore and becomes established. It was on the masthead of the Record for the first time in 1890. It's on the cornerstone of there in Blanchard that was laid in 1890. In 1907, it showed up for the first time in the college catalog. For Christ and his kingdom. As we heard earlier, that focus, this Christ-centered education, has been at the heart of what Wheaton is about ever since the beginning of the college, and he simply maintained it, in fact, enhanced it during Charles Blanchard's tenure. But the other piece that did not change was the liberal arts focus. If we had a few moments more, I won't take the time, I could read you some things from his own stance and what was being said about the college, the emphasis upon our liberal arts identity. We were never a Bible college. We were never a vocational orientation. We were always this liberal arts focus designed to turn out people of broad and deep learning, with the vocational coming in at some next level, whether it's law school or medical school or business school or dental school or seminary or on-the-job training. The college has never allowed the vocational to force out the broad liberal arts content of the undergraduate experience at Wheaton. And we today are fighting that tooth and nail. There's huge pressure to vocationalize the curriculum at Wheaton College. It comes from the culture. It comes from everyone who sees college education. It's all about career preparation. It's all about what job you can get. How much money can I earn with a Wheaton degree? And you know where those questions are coming from. You feel them because you're coming up with these large amounts to pay for your education. It's expensive. But I have to say that is not what this place is about. This is about broad and deep learning. We're about turning out educated people. This is education for a life, not training for a job. The vocational comes next, but you take this broad Christian liberal arts education with you. As an educated person, you go into law or business or medicine or service or government or whatever it is, and you are by far, for an entire lifetime in the workplace, far better and stronger than you could ever be without this educational base. You've heard me say, some of you have heard me say, I worked with the Christian Medical Society for years, and one of the things you learn about physicians in America, it really is true. It's an adage with many exceptions, but it tends to be true that doctors in America are highly trained and poorly educated. They went through pre-med and then med school and then residence and then practice. They know medicine. But you get them onto other subjects, and very often the eyes kind of glaze over. They don't know much about it. They don't care much about it, aren't interested, but they know medicine. Highly trained, but poorly educated. We get our students into some of the best medical schools in the country, but they go there broadly and deeply educated. Then they get their medical training, and for a lifetime as physicians, they are far better and stronger and richer and more useful to their patients because they go there as well-educated people. That's the genius of this place. It has been that from the beginning, a Christian liberal arts institution. And we have people like Charles Albert Blanchard to thank for it. He died in 1925 at the age of 77 after those 40-some years as president of Wheaton College. You and I today are indebted to this man, this generation that has gone before us and speaks to us today, calling us to who we are. Let's pray together. Our Father, even as we remembered these names earlier in this service, we remember the name of Charles Blanchard and that generation that brought the college into the Wheaton that we know today. We thank you for them, for their leadership, for their courage, for their discipline, for their hard work. We are the beneficiaries of their efforts, and we express gratitude over the generations to you for raising up leaders like this. We ask that you would use them to teach us across these many years who we are and who we need to be. We pray for Jesus' sake. Amen. Bless you.
For information on this or other video programming from Wheaton College, please call 630-752-5061 or email wetn@wheaton.edu. A guide to WETN video programming is available at wetn.org.